Good morning, everybody. Thanks for your patience. This is Jimmy with FontLab, and we have Peter Fraterdeus here to talk to us about letterpress printing. And he's been doing this since the 70s. If you have an old fontographer manual, you'll also see his name in there. So he's just world famous. And also, I'm getting the impression that I'm way behind the times, since all I've ever done is go to a service bureau and get some film. But Peter promises me he's going to take me to the next stage and get me in the 21st century with the polymer plates. So he's got some beautiful stuff to show us. And then at the end here, I'd like you to hang around and you can nuke us with your questions, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, Peter. I'm going to shut off my webcam and save some bandwidth, okay? You ready, Peter?
Okay, thanks everybody for, I'm having a hard time with the media here this morning. I apologize for that. We will proceed. Thank you very much. Okay, start just by saying a little bit about who I am and what I've done here, and what we're talking about today, design and typography for the 21st century letterpress, but really design and typography is just about letterpress. In any case, it's about, design and typography. There are certain things, of course, which tries to apply, regardless of web design or typographic or letterpress. It does. The design is design and typography is typography. Let's see. I apologize. I'm hearing some background noise there. Is that the microphone on the other side?
Yeah, that might have been my mute button went off. You should be good now.
In any case, I apologize because we are a little bit overdue here, and I've been struggling with my Macintosh to get this thing back on track. I hope that we'll be able to get going here smoothly. Just a second, I'm looking for my notes here. Okay. So part of what we're talking about is the reason that everybody's here today is because you're interested in letterpress, which of course is something which has grown back from come back from the grave, more or less. I mean, there in the 1980s, 70s, and 80s, letterpress was pretty much left for dead. And fortunately, there were people that were saying, well, wait a minute, there's something valuable here, and we're going to hold on to our stuff. And then there were other people who were, continuing to work with it all this time. The idea being that designing for letterpress should begin with a clear understanding of the physical nature, that is, that it's a relief process, a relief printing process. These slides as I'm clicking on them. This is part of a wood type composition series that I did some years ago in the early 90s. I'm keeping an eye on your chat, on the chat window here. It says some people are still having a hard time hearing okay. I hope this will clear up over the next few minutes, but we'll carry on. Okay, so this is part of this wood type composition monoprint series, and again showing the evidence of the physical nature of the printing. This one is a more recent wood type composition. So I'm just going to go through a few examples here of the letterpress work that I've done. There'll be some more examples coming. These are what I call monoprint series, so each one is different. It's part of the using the press as a printmaking medium. So when we look at the history of printing, the most powerful and immediate impressions forms that respect rather than ignore the inherent nature of the medium. And there are a lot of people doing amazing experimental letterpress these days. So you have to come back to the fact that it's something which is it's based on the idea that the the surface of something is inked and then imprinted into the paper. This is, in fact, an impression from a typeface designed by Sergei Egorov a couple of years ago, which he asked me to do some test prints of this new typeface he calls the Academia, a Cyrillic version of Garamond. So what I'd like to just tell people is that if you're going to be printing something, you may as well design it well. And so this idea that you can, when you type something in design or in any layout program, you have a physical margin, if you will, which is similar in principle to the way the type was put in a composing stick. And the idea is that the physical is not the same as the physical margin. So what I'd like to point out is that we can take the time to arrange things. The subtlety is important. If you're going to print something, particularly if you're printing on letterpress, which takes so much additional effort, then it's not like going to the copy. There are these small differences that make all the difference, if you will. So we have, not just for letterpress, all of these things actually come together with any kind of typographic arrangement. Considering, the optical scaling and so forth, that in the 1990s in particular, Adobe started to produce some really beautiful fonts. Adobe produced some beautiful fonts which had this caption capacity, or the caption weights, which let people start to use, develop for optical sizes. Excuse me, I'm a little bit distracted here by the technological issues. In any case, this is some of the work that we've done in slow print over the last few years. Slow print being a letterpress studio in Dubuque, and the Zen of Letterpress business cards are a template-based series of designs, which customers that are not designers can send their information. When they order the cards, they can send the information, and we lay out the cards based on the template. The idea here is that I actually produced a version of typeface, the sans serif here, which is optically balanced better for press in the caption sizes. And you'll see here the difference in the counter spaces, the eye of the font, difference in size and the punctuation and so forth. Quanta is available from myfonts.com. In fact, it seems like a couple of different fonts named Quanta, unfortunately. Mine was the first one, so just be sure you're getting the real thing if you look for it. Okay, here we can see, again, the larger punctuation, the additional space inside the letters, and so forth. If you look, just take a quick look here at these serifs. I hope you can see my cursor moving across. So I ran into trouble with the photopolymer with some of these modern faces, the Didon families and so forth, because of the photopolymer starting to bend under pressure or just not really holding up in those sizes. So I'll show some solutions to that a little bit later. And I hope that the sound is coming through okay. These are the Zen of Letterpress templates. What I'm going to talk about is this number 10 template in this particular case example. So this was the data taken directly from the client and pasted into the template, and we can see that it's just not working very well as far as the design goes. And so my example is simply to considering what can we do to typographically to make this more appropriate. And again, these are typographic things which are not only letterpress oriented, but for me, because I'm printing with fine papers and I'm taking the extra time and so forth, I like to make sure that the type is as good as I can get it. And that's just my way of approaching it. So this first iteration from the lining numerals to old style numerals, we're going small caps for the Canadian code and the name of the country, moving things around a little bit. I've also reduced the actual cap size by a half point or so here because they just seemed excessively large. If I go back one, let's see if that'll. To me, the W here is a strange, the double V it should be, and the when I switch to the small caps here, this didn't work really as small caps, but it still looked excessively large compared to. Actually, just dropped the point size a little bit. These are these what I call typoglyphics, or these to help move everything along visually. And here, actually got rid of the URL, which the client agreed to because it's a long, lengthy URL, and it just makes the card look that much better. If people are really looking for the website, they can figure it out usually from here. If it's there already, it's another thing if it says Hotmail, of course. And here, speaking of the letterpress aspects, I've actually added a little bit of stroke weight to the W in Winnipeg because having made it smaller, having made the type size smaller, the stem weight was starting thin. So I add a 1/16 of a point stroke to that character alone. So typographic finesse is not just for Wall Street bankers. I like to say it's for anybody that really cares about their typographic image and to spend the time to work with the tools that we have. So this is Garamond, Adobe Garamond. Again, talking about the idea of negative space, considering the visual balance of the letters as opposed to some mechanical balance, so that if we were to take this type, which was actually set in a stick, in a composing stick in metal back in the early 90s or late 80s, when I had my shop in the Chicago area, produced this piece in Optima, and this is Frederick Gaudi's Deep D in Italic. So we're considering the optical alignment. So when I talk about letterpress for 21st century, typography for 21st century letterpress, I'm also just talking. The piece printed on dampened Letra paper. This card, by the way, is available through the .com website. Robert Bringhurst, of course, had lots of good advice. And I'm going to try to show these movies here. We've had trouble with them earlier, and I'm sorry about the technical difficulties, but this was the intention here, anyway, is to show the process of making these certain types of changes. And of course, I had this whole thing set up earlier, and we had to restart because the connection was not good. I'm not sure why we're having so much trouble with it today. I will post the movies on YouTube. That's for the chin. Where is it coming up here? Okay, let's see if this works.
Having made the take up some space there and adjusted it, it's still not quite right, so I have to.
I don't think the audio on that movie is going to work.
Okay, let me just turn it off. I'll try to explain what I'm doing and keep up with myself. Simply going into the when we take a font right out of the font menu and use it directly, considering what the visual characteristics are, there are a lot of different things you can do with the font to help bring some subtlety into your typographic arrangement. So what I'm aiming for here is both consider the in letterpress. So these are business cards, and so these fonts are going to be very, very small in the final, and the points are small. So I'm actually increasing the size of the point here by a couple of. Should say I'm increasing the size of the period by a couple of points, changing the sizes of the alignment of the @ sign. So it has to do as much as anything with really paying attention to what you're seeing in front of you. And just every font, in fact, has different characteristics, and the typographer is responsible to make the best use of them. What I'm aiming to do here is to increase the size of some of these punctuation marks, because in letters, of course, there's physical forces involved which are going to add stress to these. And in Polymer, these little dots will regularly disappear as you're printing. So if I make them larger, and in fact, in my caption version of these fonts, many of them I've done already. In this case, I think this is used. Yeah. This was before I actually added some of these characteristics itself. So I'm making some of these changes in design. And many times, with the subtle changes in the typography, it's not really the font itself, it's the typographer that has to make these changes. So I'm going through and looking at of the center points and so forth. Sometimes they're aligned for the capitals, sometimes they're aligned for the lowercase. I have a question about the letterpress plates in metal. The same thing really applies. The photopolymer is somewhat less stiff, but the details in the printing, if you have a very small dot, such as the period after the P here in Thomas P. O'Driscoll, that's going to be very, very small regardless of the type of plate that you have. And so I tend to like to enlarge those in any case. The caption font, if it's designed for very small sizes, will include a lot of these things. But I point out people are often using fonts which are not designed for letterpress. And I should say they're not designed for captions, and so it's important to consider the optical characteristics when making the plates, designing for the plates. A question also about the depth of the relief plates. The actual depth of the relief on the plate itself, I do have an image here coming up shortly, which will show the plate itself. So we can get onto that. The actual depth of the plate is not as important as whether how much punch you want to put into the paper. And we'll see some examples of both of those shortly. That's the end of this movie. The other movie, since I've got them here, I might as well just show them both. The other one actually has to do with preparing the plate, preparing the artwork for books, and this is true of any sort of printing process that uses individual colors in the plate. And again, I'll post these. We're getting the letterpress specific here shortly. In any case, this as a tip for people that are doing letterpress or taking artwork from clients, I just want to bring this up because it's pretty important. And that has to do with using in Illustrator, I've had my clients provide me with artwork which is converted to because otherwise I'd have to have all of the fonts they've got. I often need to go in and actually adjust colors and adjust other characteristics of the art to make it really the best fit for letterpress or for any of plate-based reproduction. What I've got here is a piece of artwork that actually has 5 different black colors in it. They're all different. And what we're going to do is make sure that they're a single color, because we want spot colors as opposed to CMYK. So it's something to keep in mind. So I choose one color, change it to an exact shade, choose a Pantone black, which replaces all 5 of those other colors that were used in there. How they ended up with 5 colors, I really don't know. So in any case, this is an important thing it works with type, it works with whatever you're using. You want to make sure that you only have one plate and not 4 CMYK plates or a bunch of different spot colors. Okay, let's get on to the next thing, because we will talk now about some of the more specific typographic work. So again, dots and points are often too small. I will actually go in sometimes, draw in another point if I need to. And here directly to the font editor, or if necessary, if I'm just working with a headline, I will add in points in the serifs, for instance. So I've added these points in order to correct the optical characteristics. Why that one is easy. Oh boy, let's see here. Why am I not getting good display on these? Well, it's hard to see because the display is not finding the image properly. In any case, nope, that's not going to show us what we need to see at all. What I'm doing here is, in fact, allow me to just take 1 second to bring this up. There must be a bad link in this in the presentation because it's not linking to the image correctly. I have a question about why not thicken the serif. I find that it's the thickening the serif simply makes it look heavier, and all I'm really looking for is to gain a bit of weight at the edges so that they remain square. There are optical characteristics in that regard. I'm going to open this up here. You can see a bit better, I think, in this one. This one. Okay, now we can see the top and bottom. And these are, keeping in mind that these are this is a design for very, very small type. And with the polymer, and just in general, I find that it's important to have a little bit of extra strength at the ends there. It just ends up printing better. Let's see if I have a slide of this here. You can, this actually has more to do with the question of color, and that is that I'll get back to this if we need to. In fact, color has more hue, it reflects more color, and small areas of color tend to look very dark. Different point though. Let me find my examples. These were the sequence is a little bit different than I was intending to go here, I'm afraid. In any case, I was thinking about the typographic arrangement and the fact that this one I actually forgot to do the C optically, so it's a little bit set visually. More business card designs. The curve points, extra points are actually corner points rather than curve points. I don't suppose that it's going to make that much difference if it was a curve or a corner. They're very, very small. Just in here somewhere is the that actually has that in it. I do apologize for the disorganization here. It's Jim and I did a technical test last week and everything went beautifully, but we have had some problems with the DSL in the area, and although I'm getting good test results, for some reason things are not uploading as they should. I apologize for that. We had perfect results last week. This is a card I designed for my own company. Letterpress on the back with a texture. It's a duplex card, so the color is from the burgundy color is the paper, and then I overlaid it with sort of a tinted varnish. It has a little bit of metallic powder in it. This was again designed in Illustrator and printed in 4 colors on the Heidelberg. As far as the specific to do with designing the font design, as much as anything, has to do with keeping the negative space involved. Rather. Okay, sorry, I'm trying to keep an eye on the chat window also. The point I was going to make about the color, the client who was having these business stationery designed, let me see, maybe I can get back to that quickly. The client was looking to have a dark purple. It was, in the Pantone book, it was the deepest hue in the range of purples. Here we are. And so it was actually quite a bit darker than what you see here. And I recommended to him to choose one which was quite lighter, because look at it here, and it's a big wall, what I call the kitchen wall effect. When you see that whole wall of color, it looks kind of purpley. But when you see them individually, it looks much, much darker because it's surrounded by the white. I was very happy with the results. This particular piece, by the way, is printed pretty deep into the paper. This is one of the characteristics of Letterpress, was the dimensionality of it, which is part of what keeps everybody so interested, I think, because it's Hutch rather than all high tech. We can get a little of each. Not everything that we print is printed quite so deeply. And in fact, this is a philosophical question in the press community. Most of these questions as really philosophical, if you will. I just philosophical question. What I meant was, I think of it as a range or a continuum. So as long as one can choose where one wants to be in the continuum for a particular project, do I want deep impression? Do I want light impression? What do I do to get the best possible impression in that instance? Somebody's asking about, Pictorico out of real film. That's a good question. I can tell you what I know about it, but I use real film for everything, partly because most of the work I've been doing, these kind of jobs require very, very resolution type on the film because the image is so small. Yes, the question is, do I use high content for the stock? Well, we'll print on whatever anybody wants us to print on, really, because I can use, chipboard or fine handmade board. The press doesn't really care. There are characteristics of each that have to be considered. A lot of the finest printing that I do, anytime I'm working with wood type and want to make a really fine impression, I like to use a rag stock and dampen it beforehand. And this gives the capacity to get a really perfect impression with very little ink, so you're not likely to squeeze ink out from under the impression with a sign of over-inking. The type of stock makes a huge difference in whether the impression flattens the fibers completely when the ink is made. This particular card, which I designed for myself a few years ago, is on a German etching paper, so it's got very high. In other words, the thickness of it is quite substantial compared to the weight, and that allows the fibers to collapse under impression and become very flat. So there's very, very little ink here. As you can see, the fine lines, this is actually a business card, so the very fine lines are fine indeed. The amount of ink is very small, but it still gives a good solid coverage because of the flowing of the fibers. Yes, Jay. Right. So the main thing, as far as it goes, whether it's a kiss impression or a deep impression, and this is where when I'm printing a deep impression, I want it to be as sharp as if it was just kissed on the surface of the paper. I like this, which is a remnant from my first letterpress shop, and it's a remnant of my first experiments with digital type design. As Jim said earlier, I was involved in the early beta testing of Fontographer back in the 1980s. And this image, which I designed in Mac Paint, a bitmap editor, the first bitmap editor for the Macintosh, I made into a magnesium cut in the mid-80s. I think it may be one of the very first pieces of digital art produced for letterpress printing. And there is the impression on the letterhead. Sorry. So it was from the quill, the foundry type, to the design in reverse and flipped and flopped, in bitmap and vector and so forth. This is some more wood type work, experimental. Really what I've been doing lately is teaching. I did a workshop with Eric Spiekerman's studio in Berlin not long ago. I've taught at the Hamilton Wood Type Museum, Columbia College Center for Book and Paper Arts, and so forth. Most of the teaching I'm doing has to do with the windmill, the Heidelberg windmill, but I really love experimental work, experimental printmaking with the letterpress, with the typographic elements, wood type being a major one in that sense. This letterpress.expert is my new domain, which I don't claim to be the expert, but it was just a great domain. I couldn't pass it up. So I'm happy to have some questions, further questions, and again, apologize for the technical glitches. Kerning inconsistent in the wood type image, is that the question? I think well, in slides somewhere, which we were having trouble with the slides, I'm sorry to say. Oh, here's just shop. This is the old slow print shop. Let me see if I can find the wood type itself that was printed from. I'm with my Heidelberg. And the domain was too good to pass up, so letterpress.expert. You can also find me at fraterdeus.com and look for slowprint.com for letterpress specifics. Because of the question about the wood type, let me find my slides here. We were having trouble with the slideshow earlier, but I should be able to get that up. I really appreciate everybody's patience today. It's just never fails, does it? There are lots and lots of pics on my Google Plus photos and albums. You can find me there. Lots of letterpress pics. Okay, I'm just going to find that one photo here. So slowly. All right. I'm sorry. Just clicking in places that I'm not expecting it to now. Okay, let's not go there at all. Go here. No, let's go. Okay. Well, there are things here I was hoping to show in the slideshow, but we're unable to get that to go, unfortunately. Let me see if I can just find that one piece, the slow print. There it is. So this one, there's our the wood type for that piece that you were asking about. This kerning is inconsistent because it's difficult to actually kern in places. So the only thing you can do is actually add space. You can't delete space. It's a little bit tricky there. This was a demo that I did quickly for a class. Running through the font changes again. Yeah, the strengthening the corners of things, the opening up the counters. There are a number of points where, let me get back to that slide. In particular, in this area, in the very small points in a caption font, it's likely to fill in a bit because the ink actually spreads through the corner. And many times you'll see this really extended quite a lot, as you can see here in the N. That the weight in the diagonal is made narrower, but it's actually likely to fill in a bit in the corners, and that adds a bit of weight back. The other thing is the counters. We make larger specific adjustments if I'm going for a kiss versus a deep impression. Well, a deep impression is relative to the size of the type matter, I suppose. I mean, if I'm doing something with wood type or something of a large, that's a big, heavy, solid, then the impression is not as much of an issue. You want to get into the paper to flatten those fibers. But if you're talking about tiny type and making a deep impression with tiny type, then it often is kind of counterproductive. If you were specifically looking to make that distinction, a kiss impression is literally this is what the difference between Baskerville and the printers before him is, that he designed his type and has actually produced a machine, the calendaring roller, to smooth out his paper so that it would be as smooth as possible, and he laid the type as gently as possible on that surface, laid the ink as gently as possible with very little impression. He designed his type for kiss impression, and all the specifics of Baskerville, the original Baskerville, were designed with that in mind. Prior to that, the history of printing going back to Gutenberg, I wouldn't call it a deep impression, but every printer had to put some pressure in because the paper had irregularities and it was not polished on the surface. So the types that were designed before Baskerville were inherently designed for more of an impression, if you will. And Baskerville and the moderns following were designed more for a surface impression, so that many of the details in the Didones and Bodonis and moderns are actually designed to sit on the surface rather than go deep into the paper. When one does put those serifs deep into the paper, you'll see that it is kind of counteracts the effect of the serif, so it doesn't look as skinny, it doesn't look as fine-edged as it might want to. So with my business card printing, we rarely do deep impression. in the contemporary use of that word. There is some impression, certainly, but not deep into the paper, partly because the paper itself is not that thick. When I do a impression, I want to have a deep paper so that it doesn't the back of the paper, but actually sinks into the surface of the paper. What I call, instead of a kiss impression, more of a passionate embrace. And that's what we look for at slow print, certainly, is I think the main thing is, as much as anything, to know the continuum, to know the spectrum of options that you have as a printer and as a designer. That if you choose to do something that's very fine on a glossy paper or a different type of stock, that you can choose that. If you want to go for something that's got a thick, heavy, deep impression, then you go for something like that. Maybe I'll bring up just a few images as we're going through. This was I wanted to show this process. Here's the we're running short on time here. I'm happy to stick around if we have time. I'm happy to stick around and answer more questions. This is the plate for the project ink card. As you can see, it's the photopolymer. It's a 6-up on the base on the press. In the press, here's a press sheet. It's already been run through once. I do a work and turn, run them 6-up on both ends of the sheet. They are cut. And this one is interesting. It is on a very soft paper, and so we could get impression. What we did here, because of the density, everybody always wants, light colors on black paper. The only one I've been able to get work at all, to my satisfaction, is silver. And what we've done here is actually to print them twice, so that the first time through, everything, all the matter on the card was printed. The second time through, I stripped away all the fine type and reprinted the cards with only the Project Ink logo. And you can see the difference there. It makes a huge difference, so that the fine type is kind of gray, which is the effect that's actually very elegant, I think. And the heavy type gets enough ink in it to come through properly. This is something which I wouldn't try it on any press but the Heidelberg, because the registration is absolutely perfect. I can run those cards back through the press and hit it exactly in the same place. This one is another piece. It's a bit more impression you can see here. This was printed dampened paper. I think I mentioned this earlier, where the Crane's Lettre was dampened first and let sit overnight so that it equalizes. The original type was set in metal in the 1990s and hand separated. And then I found the type staying in my galleys, and after moving the shop a number of times, and we made photopolymer from it and printed from the photopolymer. What I was just going to mention about this was that the depth of the image here, it seems quite deep, but it's partly because the paper was dampened that it collapses so beautifully and flattens, the fibers flatten underneath the type. Paper's dampened with the old style. I've done it a number of ways through the years, but finally ended up with the old style dampening, which is to take 5 or 6 sheets. It depends on what kind of how heavy the paper is, and take 5 or 6 together and dunk the whole bunch through a vat of water. I have a large 18 by 24 photo tray, so I'll take the whole bunch of 5 or 6 sheets, put them in the water, and stack them, and then take another stack, do the same thing, then put them under pressure overnight, and sort of the dry ones in the center absorb not enough moisture. Yes, as far as the question, Let's go back to that one. This one is you're asking, is it Rami? Rory? I can't quite read the name. Asking about the double impression. Yes, the double impression was for the logo, and the light type was only once. And this, if we go back to the actual plate, you can see that I've actually scored this. I'm giving away the trade secrets here, but I've actually scored the plate beforehand because these small bits were actually stripped off. The solid or the logos were left in place. So it's not as if I'm going to re-register anything. Everything was registered exactly the same. So I just stripped away the plate in order to print that. A question about different oil and water-based inks. I don't actually use water-based inks. There are some out there, but they're very, very rarely used, certainly not in commercial lettering. I've seen some use of that, and there are differences because of the difference in viscosity and surface tension and so forth. But I can't really tell you much about water-based inks on dampened paper, I'm afraid. I expect that depending on what you were doing, you know, if you were using like an acrylic, which is water-based, but it's still stiff like an acrylic paint, acrylic, you know, painter's paint, fine art paint, it would probably act much like an oil-based ink does. You know, if you have any particular kinds of concerns or questions, please do contact me through my website. It's fraterdeus.com or letterpress.expert. That's one of our new domain, top-level domain of .expert, and I just couldn't pass it up when I saw it. This was kind of an interesting job. Just a couple of slides since we have a minute left. This was an experimental piece working with Plike paper, which is available from Legion and distributors. Plike is kind of a plastic-like paper, they call it. And I thought it would work well with the metallic ink. And then we die cut these parts. They end up, you can use them like that or like a pin or whatever you want.
Peter, I think we may have missed some questions if we scroll back in the chat. Maybe take a look and see if we missed anybody.
Okay. I'm looking for some questions. Here we go. Method for spacing between the round letters. Well, it's all about optical adjustment. And what I always tell students about spacing is if it looks right, it is right, and it's not a question of measuring, you know. Let's see. Font changes, yeah. Okay. Were there other questions that I've missed here?
Well, there was somebody asking about the process in InDesign. I don't know what else you could show in InDesign other than, you know, preparing the plates like you were in the print setup for the CMYK. I don't know what else you could show.
Let's see here. Physical impression. Right.
And I think people were also interested in, were there other tips for things you can do to your font besides the idea of adding some extra points to the serifs? Did you have some other tips for pre-processing your font, like in a font editor?
Well, the main thing was not so much just adding points, but also being aware of the visual and optical characteristics. And in many cases, if you have a caption font, such as the ones from some of the Adobe Pro collections, Garamond or Caslon, or Arno is one of my favorites, being a Jensen-like font family. Caption font will have some of this stuff built in, of course, and you don't have to worry as much about it. So the main thing is to be aware of the fact that at small sizes, whether it's letterpress or any other medium, you need more space between letters. You need a little less contrast if you have a contrasting stem weight. These kind of characteristics of the caption font will come in useful in letterpress as well. I was looking for the question about InDesign. Let's see. Oh, here. Designing in Font Studio, then the kerning. Right, exactly. You have to do it so that it looks right. And the main thing with that is, in terms of optical spacing, it can be very, very helpful to simply do two versions and overlay one on top of the other and kind of flip back and forth between to see how it looks, which one looks better, do A/B variations. And oftentimes, one of the keys is if you have a Roman font, which is based on a circle, say, even if it's sans serif, it's still a circular form for the O, that's going to require more variation in the letter spacing. You're going to have some letters that are closer together. The curved letters are closer. The straight-stemmed ones are farther apart, simply because the area between them is what's important, not the distance, if that makes sense. If you have something which is like a highly compressed design, Franklin compressed or Univers heavy compressed, then you have very little variation in the space between letters. The different pairs of letters are all very similar because they're all kind of vertically stressed with even the curved letters have vertical sides, and so there's very little difference between them. Correct. That's yes, as Jay points out. Jay points out that spacing in general rather than kerning. Kerning is the adjustment between two letters in particular, where spacing or tracking in some cases. Kerning is largely used these days as a term which is becoming used for adjusting spacing globally, but it's technically, in the old days, a kern was actually a piece of metal cut out of one letter so the other one would fit closer next to it. Right. Range kerning is a contemporary digital use of the word kern. Somebody was asking about adding a 16th. It's a 1/16th of a point stroke to thicken up small type when true small caps are not available. That's something that I will do periodically, and many times when I get artwork from designers where they've used a very small font or very small sizes for various type matter. Depending on the type design, it's sometimes almost you almost have to add some weight to the stroke because otherwise the hairlines will just disappear on the plate. You end up with problems trying to get consistent inking because the fine lines just sort of disappear. So I'll often go in and add, if not globally, to a whole line of letters or an area of type, I'll add, a 16th of a point, which is 0.0625 points, and it's very, very little. But in fact, if it's on both sides of the letter, it's actually adding an 1/8 of a point. So it adds a bit of weight all the way around. What you don't want to do, of course, is then have details being lost in that regard. But it's a technique which is extremely valuable. So, and this is another reason that I always have to have the designs converted to paths before they get to me. If they're not, then I don't have the fonts, then I can't do some of these corrections that make for the best possible results. With polymer, oh yes, well with polymer, that's the nice thing about, as Oliver points out, with polymer or any kind of digital reproduction, or for that matter, if you carved it yourself in linoleum, you can kern however you want. You can overlap letters if you want to. So it's really, and in fact, in some regards, and some people may take offense at this, but I think that the typography we can do today with contemporary tools is far better. You have the potential to do far more subtle typographic adjustments than you ever could in metal. It just simply was not possible, or it was so time consuming that only the utterly obsessed would bother. And being a calligrapher, of course, I go back to before there was printing, at which point you could do whatever you wanted with your letters. And that's what's nice about the digital form, is that we can really you can put the letter, you can put the form, you can put the space exactly where your eye wants it, as opposed to being absolutely constrained by that physical grid. The range of Letterpress Ink Squeeze. Well, honestly, in my printing, I aim to have no squeeze at all in the letterpress impression. And by that, the term ink squeeze has to do with the fact that on a glossy paper or a coated paper, some of the ink will always come out from under the plate because there's no place for it to go. With high textured contemporary letterpress papers or any kind of fine art printmaking papers, there's lots of room in the paper itself. The microstructure of the physical surface allows for the ink to actually sink into the paper under the impression. So if I look back at some of these impressions that I've shown here, you will actually see that the bottom of the well is where the ink, if you will. Let me see if I can, yeah, like this one even. Oops. That this, you see the curvature of the paper as the fibers are drawn down into the bottom of the well, of the flat surface at the bottom is the top surface of the form. And we're looking to have no squeeze out from that at all. So I tend to use very light ink and use paper which keeps that ink perfectly if possible. And so there's practically no squeeze. But for the faster your print, the more commercial you get, the more squeeze you should plan for. Does that make sense? And over elaborate there. The thorns for the corners. Yes, if again, one of my favorite typefaces is Copperplate Gothic, which is Frederick Gaudi's wonderful, kind of like his greatest hit in some ways. It's probably the one font that was used everywhere. And the thorns that he put on the corners of Copperplate Gothic have become iconic in their own ways because people are now using that font at 48 points and larger on the side of a bus. So you see these giant sort of slabs on the Copperplate Gothic, but the reason they were there in the first place was to make sure that the corners looked sharp at caption sizes, because that Gothic font in a letterpress shop would have come on a 6-point body, but with 6, 4, and 2-point letters body. And at that size, you have to have additional physical edge to the corner, or it rounds off. You don't even see it as a corner anymore. So the slabs on the ends of Copperplate Gothic are really there for optical reasons rather than stylistic reasons. But it's now become sort of an iconic font in its own right. So it's as much as anything, the important thing is considering, is this a caption font? Is it designing for very small sizes, in which case you probably do want those. If it's going to be used in very small sizes on screen, you probably don't want them. So it's partly a question of, are you really designing for what medium are you designing for? And I am happy to, take further questions today. If anybody cares to send email, you're more than welcome. You go through my website at fraterdeus.com and use the comment or contact form. I'll be happy to tell you what I can. And I certainly look to hearing from people at conferences. We've been around to the A-Type-I in Barcelona. Next year is A-Type-I in Sao Paulo, if anybody's going there. I hope to be there. And I try to get around and teach letterpress wherever I can. If anybody's looking to learn, we do classes here in Dubuque at Slow Print, and periodically have also done private classes for professional printers seeking to improve or perfect their letterpress impression. So with that, I think we're about ready to wrap up.
Yeah, I don't see any more questions. I think we did the best we could with the audio. I think that I'm noticing that every time a picture loads, like maybe it's like a progressive JPEG that's loading, then the audio distorts. So we've actually learned some things from this webinar that maybe we can make the next webinar better. So thanks a bunch. Oh, do you have one more question here?
I've got one more question.
Ink traps.
One more question from George. Yes. It's not so much ink traps for those as much as it is a visual thing in terms of the Quanta example where I'm opening up those corners. What happens is as the type gets smaller, if you make the type half the size, so go down from say 16 to 8 points, the area inside is actually reducing by the square of that. So if it's half the size, then it's a quarter of the area. So we're trying to open up a certain amount of space there so it doesn't end up looking like a little black dot with no features at all. So it's not as, I mean, it serves the same purpose in some cases with, yeah. So the squeeze, there's going to be squeeze if you're printing on a coated paper and you have enough ink to make it solid. If you print, of course, one of the nice things about letterpress is you can print without ink. You can do blind impression, and you don't have to worry about it squeezing at all. But it has, as much as anything, it has to do, if you look through a loop at a printed, piece printed in the 1950s on a glossy coated paper with letterpress, there's definitely a squeeze there, and they had to design for that, and also for newspapers and so forth, trying to design fonts that would work well with these kind of dynamic smudging going on everywhere. But in our case, with contemporary digital letterpress, I think the goal is to have as much control as possible over your ink and your surface, so you're not as worried about this gooshing out effect. On the other hand, some people, I mean, Kenning does a fantastic job with ink. It's just kind of gooshing out from under his wood type, and he makes these posters that are just incredibly powerful and dynamic. So it's a question of that dynamic continuum and choosing where you want to be, designing specifically for a particular purpose, and then choosing to print the way that you seek to print the end result, rather than sort of just having it all be accidental without any control over it. So thanks again to FontLab for having me, and apologies again for the technical problems. And please do take a look at the photos on my website and let me know what you think. I look forward to hearing from you. Thanks so much.
Thanks a bunch. You did a great job there, and I was hoping you'd give us some kind of an advertisement, like maybe the Christmas special from Fraterdeus.com. If we buy 2 for the price of 1 or something. But boy, I wish I could have you do my business cards. Right. Beautiful stuff.
No, Jen, we'll see what we can do.
Okay. Anyway, I was going to announce that we're not going to do a webinar in December. There's just too many scheduling problems, and we're working on something in January, February for diacriticals, large format fonts, a lot of good stuff coming up. So check back again with us in January. And again, we appreciate your patience while we work all our technical problems. I think this webinar gave me some clues as to how we can solve some of those problems. So we'll look forward to seeing all of you next time, okay? Thanks a bunch. And you'll be getting a link in the email here pretty soon with the recording. All right. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Jimmy. Take care now.